Welcome back to Waterloo. My name is Jochen Kuhnemann. I'm the current chair of C&O, and it's my privilege to introduce my colleagues and distinguished speakers for this morning. The first speaker in this morning's session is my colleague Dan Younger. Dan got his PhD from Columbia in 1963. His thesis was titled Feedback in a Directed Graph. He then joined the Faculty of Math in its first year, also the first year of C&O of my department, in 67, and became a full professor in 75, and then retired in 2005, yes. So Dan is, of course, a well-known, internationally well-known graph theorist. He worked on directed graphs quite a bit and is well known for his famous theorem, the Lucchesi-Younger theorem. And he's also well known for his knowledge of the history of the department, of course. And so this morning he will talk about that, and he will talk about Bill Tutt's history in particular. Dan.
Thank you. So here's a picture of Bill Tutt. He looks to be about 50 years old to me here. And if that's true, he would have been at Waterloo for 5 years then. He would still be here for 35 more years. And much of our talk is about his work during the war. And this is Bletchley Park, the code-breaking center in Britain, a famous code-breaking center. And here is the mansion in which he had his office in the first year. He was there from 41 till 45. But in this office just for 1 year, then he moved out to one of those huts that they built. And this is the machine that he was responsible for breaking. It was built by Lorentz, but actually the British didn't know. They had never seen this machine. And they never saw the machine until the last month of the war. So they only determined what it was about by signals. You can see it's a teletype machine. They call it fish because it was just a name they made up. And tuna fish in particular, tunny. Now, this is not Enigma. Enigma is a story which, if you've gone to the imitation game, you would have heard, or in other sources. Enigma was the one machine that they publicized after the war. But this they did not publicize, and I'll explain why they didn't. Well, one of the reasons why they did not publicize this until the late 1990s. So Tutt kept this secret of what he did during the war until the late 1990s. Here is Alan Turing, who was the primary, or the focus of the cryptographic work on the Enigma machine. There is a slate statue of him that is at Bletchley Park Museum. So my talk is in 3 parts. I'm going to tell you first what happened before Bletchley, his early life, and then during Bletchley, and then the third part is what happened after Bletchley. So this is the clock tower, which lies in the center of Newmarket, England. This is where he was born. Newmarket is a town of about 20,000 people. It's pretty stable. It's not much different through the years. And actually, this is looking at the town from outside, and you can see in the foreground a horse track for training horses. Newmarket is a horse town. They've apparently been racing horses in Newmarket since the 1100s. It's the home of horse racing. Everything there is horse racing. And in fact, I went to visit a stable when I was there. It wasn't Fitzroy House, which was the name of the stable where Bill was born, but it was another house that was originally set up about a decade before Bill was born by Frederick Stanley, Lord Stanley. Does that make any sense? Actually, he was Governor General of Canada in the 1880s. And in that time, his sons were interested in playing hockey. And he established a cup for hockey, for hockey excellence. Well, in this particular picture, you can see I'm rubbing my shoulder. And that's because I had been standing next to the horse, and the horse bit me in the shoulder. And you can see we're still not friends. But the superintendent thinks this is a laugh. Yeah, Bill was born in a horse stable. His parents were the gardener in that stable and also the housekeeper. Actually, at the end of the war, so he was born in 17, and a year and a half later, the war was over, and employment was uncertain for someone of his family's work. And so they moved around England, first over to the other side of London, right near where Windsor Castle is, and then up to the north to Durham, and then over to Yorkshire. And Yorkshire is where he began school. And he thinks very nostalgically about Yorkshire, and he says, I'm a Yorkshire lad. And then back to the same area of Newmarket, but not quite in Newmarket, in a little village called Chieveley that was 3 miles out of town. And here's the 600-year-old church that's at the center of Chieveley. And there's just really one street in Chieveley, and that's High Street. And you can see it going off to the down here. It looks like there's another street going there, which is called Church Lane, but it's only 300 yards long. So, I mean, and if you look from the churchyard down, this is what you see, the High Street as it goes down. And if you go up this way for 300 yards, you come to this house, and this is where he lived as a boy. It wasn't quite as posh as it looks now. That front triangular part wasn't there. It was a duplex, and they lived in the back half of the duplex. But it looks in great shape now. But that's where he grew up and lived all of his time there. And this is the school, a half mile down the road from where we were, where he studied as a boy from 7 years old till 11 years old. And this is the one room inside the school. It's a one-room school. And this is what it looked like then. Actually, the difference between those two pictures is more photography than actually a difference between the way it looked then and now. The wall isn't there anymore, and there's Bill among his classmates sitting in the corner. This is probably his first year at Chieveley. And so, actually, there is no high school in those days near Chieveley. The nearest one is 10 miles away, and then there's another one in the city of Cambridge, which is 18 miles away. And so most of the students that you saw pictured there would finish their education at age 11 or 12, and that would be the end of their education. there was a possibility, there was a scholarship which one could apply for. And I guess there was also some parents could afford to send their children to high school. But Bill took this when he reached age 10. He took this scholarship exam, and he was successful. He and another boy, Morris Pettit, won scholarships. And this was sufficiently unusual that the headmaster declared a half-day school holiday. However, his parents said no. They wouldn't let him go. Bill was shocked. He said, "What did I do wrong?" I mean, but at any rate, he persevered, and another year later, he took the scholarship exam again, was again successful. This time, the scholarship included a bicycle. And his parents relented. So actually, we've established here at Waterloo a scholarship for undergraduates, which includes a bicycle. The first one of those was given out this spring. So with the bicycle, he was 18 miles away while he went to Cambridge and County High School for Boys. Here it is. It's not Harrow, it's not Eton, but it's a high school. And the headmaster there would like to see some of his students go to Oxford or Cambridge, but not very many did, maybe one a year. But he excelled as a student here, as with the story you can imagine. One of the subjects he was great at was history, another was chemistry, and mathematics. And here is the award that he got for sixth form mathematics, Shakespeare's Complete Works. We have that book and 4 others that he got as prizes for his high school upstairs. And he did get admission to Cambridge. Not only to Cambridge, but the most elite of the colleges of Cambridge, Trinity College. And here it is, the front entrance, and you see in the middle there is Henry VIII. He was the founder of Trinity College. It's pretty hard to get in that gate, either as a visitor or as a student, but because of my connections when I went there, I was able to get into that gate. And this is the front court of Trinity. When he was there, he was majoring in chemistry, but he met in his first year 3 other friends, and they were mathematics majors. And their other friends, Arthur Stone, Cedric Smith, and Leonard Brooks. And they worked on mathematics problems together. I think he worked on chemistry. I guess he had to do it for the day, but at night, it was always mathematics. And he would attend lectures of the Mathematical Society there. You may ask, why did he ever get into chemistry? Well, anyway, that's another story. And there they worked on a problem called squaring the square, trying to partition a square into smaller squares. That was the main focus of their work. And here shows an example of a squared square, which they found in the course of their work. And here he is, after 3 years of undergraduate study, graduating from Trinity College. And then he went on to be a graduate student in chemistry. And he worked in the very famous Cavendish laboratories doing physical experiments, physical chemistry experiments. But he found when he was doing that his mind wandered. He wasn't sure. Maybe Cavendish Laboratory is a famous place, but he wasn't enjoying himself. He was remembering his experience as an undergraduate with his 3 other friends, and that made more to him. So he graduated in 38, and now this was 1940, and he said to his tutor, I want to switch to mathematics. And this was an incredible decision. This was during the war. And by doing that, he knew that he was opening himself to the draft, that chemistry was a reserved occupation. It was important. But mathematics, so he knew when he said to his tutor, I want to switch to mathematics, that he would be drafted into the Army. But his tutor knew something else. His tutor knew, well, let's see what he knew. His tutor said he arranged for him to have an interview with some, quote, mysterious government agency. And Bill had that interview, and because of that, he was recruited to go and study in downtown Broadway on the 3rd floor of this building at the Government Code and Cipher School. This was the beginning of 1941. And so for 3 months, he studied codes that were from World War I. And actually, this was the time of the London Blitz. And he lived out of town and commuted in, but in the night, this area would be bombed. And it was bombed. There was one bomb in the area where he lived, and they got under the table. I'm not sure that that was too helpful, but in fact, nothing happened to him. So after 3 months, he was recruited. Apparently, he did very well in the school. He was recruited to go to Bletchley Park. So now I come to my second part, where I tell you about what happened at Bletchley. So here is the train station on which he would have arrived after 50 miles out from London, the way it looked then. And it's only just a short walk from the station up to Bletchley Park itself. And there's the way it would have looked through black and white eyes anyway in those days. And there was his picture when he was, I guess, his employment photo. Looks like someone who's really ready for life. When he was there, this was May of 41, Bletchley had achieved a great achievement, which you may have read about at the Battle of Mattapan. And they were concerned then with breaking the research section, with breaking a machine that was a Hagelin, a Swedish inventor, that was used by the Italian Navy. It wasn't intended for high-level security, just temporary security. And after about 2 or 3 months, the research section and Bill reduced the decipherment of codes by this machine to a routine, and so they passed it on. And then Bill was introduced to Tunney. What has happened is, well, Tunney, first messages were heard in 1940, about the middle of 1940. And at first, it was just a moan that they would hear on the radio. They didn't even know what the character of it was at all. But with oscilloscopes and things like that, they found out it was a digital signal, and eventually that it was by teletype. But what happened is in this early going, they made a mistake in sending a message, and that message was sent twice under the same decipherment, the same cipher, with a little bit of difference because the message was not repeated verbatim, but slightly different. And that difference enabled the chief cryptographer, John Tiltman, to deduce what was the message and what was the key that was added to the message to get the cipher. But this had been around for a month or so, and nobody had been able to make anything of it. What was one to make of that? Here's the format of a teletype. It actually consists of 5 rows. That little row is just to keep it advancing properly. And each sequence of 5 represents a letter or a number. Here is John Tiltman, the Scotsman on the right. In the center is Alastair Denniston. He was the head of Bletchley. And that's Vinnie Vincent, who was the head of the Italian ciphers. It looks like they're in London. So from that tape, he actually took the 4,000. He started at the top row. He said, I'll focus on the top row, the top impulse, you call it. And he said, I'm going to put it into a rectangle. And I'm going to make this rectangle, for some obscure reason, 23 times 25 long, 475 long, and then it would be about 8 wide. And he looks at this, and he begins to see that there's some resonance that goes across there. And from that, he said, I think there's a wheel of 41 spokes that's associated with the top impulse. And then he figures from that 41, he said there must also be another wheel which has 43, which has a slightly different function, but which is also associated with that first impulse. There's 12 wheels altogether. But anyway, he says 2 of these are associated with the first impulse. And then, having made that deduction, well, then he goes on to the second impulse. And then he starts telling the rest of the research section how he's doing this. And so actually they help to make sure that they don't waste any time in getting it. But basically, he completely determined the machine that produced this and how these wheels interacted just from this 4,000-word tape and some little things that were known about it. He determined the machine that produced this. It was as though they had the machine there sitting on the floor. They didn't ever see a machine, but they knew how it worked mathematically. And in fact, from that, they built their own version of it in a realized form, but they never saw this. So this was such a remarkable achievement that one of the people at Bletchley, who was a fellow of Trinity College, said, I think Tut deserves to be a fellow of Trinity for that achievement. And so he became a fellow of Trinity in 1942. Oh, well, this just shows how complicated the machine is that he's working on. So he was named a fellow of Trinity College. There you can see it above it. A person who got his degree in natural sciences has been given a fellowship in mathematics in October of 1942. And this is actually published by Cambridge. Tut said, you know, this seems like a lack of security, but he said nothing bad came of it. So, and for those of you who are worried about women's rights, you can see what's happening at the top of the page there. They only got the title of the degrees that they earned, not the degree. And so it was. Now that they knew the machine, they could read some tiny messages. Usually it was because some mistake had been made in the way that it was sent. I mean, they still didn't know how to decipher it. They only knew the machine. But these messages were so valuable because they came at the high level that it was worth putting whatever effort they could to learn how to do that. And Tut made a lot of contributions to help them. So in April of 42, this would be about a year, why a lot of the people who had been in the mansion moved out to a big concrete establishment called the Testery to work on this project. And it's called the Testery not because they're testing things, but because the person in charge is Major Tester. And here you can see that whole string of buildings was built. All the way down, that's all the Testery. That's all for the work on the Tunny machine. So comes the winter of 43, why they could no longer read any messages from this. This was what Tut, in looking back, called the winter of our discontent. I don't know whether, maybe he got that from reading that book on Shakespeare, but actually, the next line of that I see is, this was the winter of our discontent, made glorious by the Son of York. But Tut then was, because of the necessity of the situation, he had an idea as to how you could break systematically codes that were produced by this machine. And he called that the statistical method. It was based on the fact that there was, in the way letters and numbers are coded by teletype, there's a bias towards those like A and things are put with less holes than Q, just so that the machine doesn't wear out so soon. So he took advantage of that bias to create a method for determining by a machine whether or not it was what the cipher was. But the trouble with his method was that it required a computer, an electronic computer, a fast computer, to be able to actually effect this, because they had to try a lot of possibilities. And they didn't have a computer. So, in fact, they built this computer during the war, 1,500 vacuum tubes. And it was designed by Max Newman and constructed by a team headed by Tommy Flowers. Tommy Flowers had told the people at Bletchley that they, in the Enigma project, that they should be using an electronic computer. And Turing said, no, we're okay the way we are. And so he went back to his day job, but he still kept working on this computer. And so then when the day came that they said, where is that guy who was saying he wanted to build a computer? Why, he was ready for that. And so they built a computer. There's Max Newman, who designed the computer from Tut's algorithm. And Tommy Flowers, who built the computer. And here was where the computer was in a place called the Newmanry. And this was not because of that they did Newman work. It was because Newman was the head of this. But here in the back is where the actual first computer was located, at the right-hand end. It took up 1/4 of the length of that. That was right there was where Colossus 1 was. So with Colossus, they were able to read 90% of the messages that were sent by Turing. And these were very important messages, even messages from Hitler, but all high command messages. And so this made a tremendous difference, for instance, at D-Day. But earlier in the Russian front, it also made a difference. And when they couldn't read it, why the machine would tell them that, well, we can't deal with this. So the other 10%, they knew it just wouldn't work. Early on, they didn't just have to keep working at it. And you can see Tuts looks a little different from when the war started. It looks like he shows some of the signs of having worked there for 3 years. But that's Bill presumably near the end of his tenure there. And so, which is important, in the late 1990s, all this time, at the end of the war, Churchill said, let's pretend this never happened. Just destroy the Colossus. Well, actually, there were 10 of them at the end of the war, which shows itself how important this was. But he said, let's destroy the plans, let's destroy all of the computers, let's pretend this never happened. And so they did pretend. They did pretend all the way, even when news of the Enigma came out, they still were pretending. And Tut was never supposed to ever say anything about what happened. And he obeyed that. I was a close friend. He never said anything to me. But then one of the people from MI5 called Tony Sale, he says, you know, it's not right. Everyone thinks the world's first computer was ENIAC, built by the Americans. We've got to publicize this machine that was built during the war. And so at first the Brits, the government said, no, we can't do that. But then later they finally said, okay. But now they've built this, so he rebuilt this computer. And here it is. Tut says it didn't really look like the original, but anyway, it had the same. It still had 1,500 vacuum tubes and was a lot alike. And of course, once you build a computer, what was the computer used for? So then the story leaks out. And in particular, it leaks out because Tony Sale wants it to leak out. Because how can he have this computer that was built during the war without telling what it was for? And so that's why in the late 1990s, the story of what Bill did gets out. Here is where it presently is located, the rebuilt computer. And this is actually one of the buildings, one of the huts that was, I think it held one of the later versions of the Colossus at the time. So now I'll tell you about his life after Bletchley. Well, he now had a fellowship for a graduate study, and he went back to Trinity College. And this is where he lived as a graduate student on Neville's Court, which is behind the front court. There's a beautiful Wren Library, which is just out of the view there, if you have seen that. And there's the thesis that he wrote. in his 3 years of study of mathematics at Trinity College. And so after the war, well, it seemed like none of the universities in Britain were interested in combinatorics. Actually, his advisor had warned him not to work in combinatorics because nobody's interested in that. So in fact, he got a job in Canada at U of T as a lecturer in mathematics. And there he is. And when he was first here in Canada, he joined the local hiking club. And there it is that he cautiously meets Dorothea, who was the secretary of the club. Not quite sure whether to enter that space that's been left for him there, but he did, and a year later they were married in 1949. Here's the directory for the math department at the U of T in 1950 and 51, and you can see 3 names that you might recognize: Tott, Stanton, and Berman. And each of these 3 would have a special place in developing mathematics at Waterloo. So this is Waterloo before Waterloo. This is the pre-Waterloo. But there are the 3 of them. And so in 1962, he came to Waterloo. Of course, that building wasn't here then. But his coming helped that whole project of mathematics developing. And so there was that building built in 1967. And he didn't spend, well, he was the foremost person, well, one of the foremost persons in the subject of combinatorics, and so he was made editor-in-chief of what, under his tutelage, became the most prominent journal of mathematics devoted to combinatorics. And you can see from that picture, you see the squared square? And he had a wonderful career here. And he graduated in he graduated, that is. He retired in 1987. And he was given an honorary degree by the university. This is graduation day. You can see that he and Dorothea are more used to each other by now. That's where the way their home looked out in West Montrose. It's right next to the bridge there. And there's the bridge. It's right next door to the bridge. Their address is 16 Bridge Street. And in 2001, he was made an officer of the Order of Canada. And here is the Governor General proudly presenting him with his medallion. This is the citation which was there at the time. It focused on the fact that he was known for his work in graph theory, but it also cites the work that he did during the war. And certainly that was important to this. Recognition. This was a picture taken of him about that time, around 2001. Dorothea and Bill are in the grave site, which is out in West Montrose, just a few doors away, a few yards away from the general store, which is right at the center of town, and the house where they lived. He's known as her husband there, but actually Dorothea had a lot to do with the establishment of the Potter's Workshop in Waterloo. And a lot of people, sometimes in lectures that I've given, they know Dorothea, but they don't know who Bill is. In Ottawa, the CSE, the Communication Security Establishment, this is the picture of their building, why they named their research, their cryptographic research, the Tut Institute. That's my lecture.
So when he was doing his first, when he's going back from the tape to the machine, I'm assuming he was thinking it was only in German because there were allies. The Italians were involved as well. So was he given the code expressly knowing that it would be German that he was translating it into, or at some point?
Oh yes, they knew enough about the code that well, as I say, this actually, when he separated the two things, the message and the key that was added,
right.
Well, the message was in German, right?
So it had to be, okay.
Yes, and they would also know it from where it came from and other sources, shall we say.
Sort of a curiosity, do you think the Germans ever let the Italians know?
Well, that's a good question. Actually, I don't think so, particularly as the war progressed, the Italians were not really involved, shall we say. It was only in that early part that the Italians played a role when he came to Bletchley. There's also one up top.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm wondering about Bill in his early years going to the first school, which was from age 6 to age 11. He must have had a math teacher who was teaching him the fundamentals of math that allowed his brain to develop to be able to work these things through. Or did he just born a genius? Which one?
No. Well, a bit of both, I would say. But he was very interested in the children's encyclopedia that was there. And he was fascinated by astronomy, for one thing. And in fact, there was an eclipse, a total eclipse that passed over England in 1928, I guess it was, or 25 maybe it was. And he was reading everything he could that was related to astronomy. And actually, his teacher asked him out, and she bumped into him outside of school, what are you thinking about these days? And he starts telling her about the distance to Mars and all of these things. And she said, what earthly good could that be? So I don't think there was a great appreciation for his love of mathematics.
Hello, hi. We know a lot about the code breaking efforts that took place at Bletchley, but we never hear anything about the code making. Did Bletchley, were they responsible for creating the codes that were used for the British intelligence messaging?
I don't know. I doubt that effort was actually done at Bletchley, but there was the Playfair code, I believe, which they used. And I don't really know too much about that.
Okay.
But,
do we know if they were ever cracked by the Germans, the British codes?
Well, the Germans did, I think, break to some extent the Playfair code.
Okay.
I'm not too much up on that, but
I understand. Thanks.
Hello there. Thank you very much for the presentation. Truly amazing. And my question is related to your personal relationship. And with the audience in this crowd, we have an awareness of the importance of the work that he did. And we don't need to watch a movie about it. We can hear the description inside our brains. The fireworks are just flashing. As a personal friend of his, I want to understand how he treated the secrecy of what he did, the importance of it, and then the time that he was able to talk about it with you. How did he manage the secrecy of that important work for so long?
Yes, I think it actually affected his personality, the fact that he was keeping this secret. A lot of people think of him as very reserved or wouldn't talk to people. And I know some of that myself, shall we say. The way I got to know him was a bit the way Dorothea got to know him, that is, through hiking. So we would hike together. And so we wouldn't say anything. We just enjoy each other's presence. And I would sort of somehow, in the course of time, know enough not to push on some buttons, shall we say. But he never, in all of that time, spoke to me about what he did. A lot of people ask, what did he say to Dorothea? And that's a good question, which is a little bit hard to answer because he once spent 80 days in England working at Cheltenham, where they had their modern code breaking. And he has to tell Dorothea why he's there, I guess. I don't know. But anyway, I can't really describe the relationship between Dorothea and him, but I can tell you that somehow he never told me up till the time of that. I mean, in some ways, he tried to, I think, make up for it a little bit afterward. Like, he invited me to go to the presentation in Ottawa. I mean, we were good friends, but there was an area where he wouldn't talk.
Hi. Some time ago, I saw a film in which you were part called The Code Breakers. And
Yes.
It seemed to disappear from BBC for a while. Do you know if it's available again?
Yeah, I would hope you can get a hold of it. If you're desperate, you can write to me, and I can make a copy from the one I have.
Okay.
So you can put your name down on a list. But yes, that's a very good source of information. And in terms of public awareness, it's probably the most important piece.
Yes, his work still doesn't seem to be that well known.
Oh, not at
Turing's
all.
Still getting all
Just
the credit.
last Thursday, the London Times had an article about the fact that, well, there was another thing besides Enigma. This is last Thursday. And, I mean, it seems like that, I guess that guy had visited Bletchley or something, I don't know. But I mean, it is amazing. I mean, here I'm giving you a lot of detail, and a lot of journalists, et cetera, don't know about these things.
Yeah, that film was on TVO and PBS.
Right. Oh, yes, it was actually quite often shown here in Canada.
Thank you.
Thank you for this amazing presentation. This has got me interested into combinatorics, and I wanted to know, like, can you give a brief intro of what it is and its relevance in today?
Oh, what is combinatorics? Oh. Well, wow. Actually, it took the British a long time to find out what combinatorics was itself. And I mean, his advisor said, you know, he should work on something else. He shouldn't work on that. But he persisted, again, on working on that. Actually, Tut a lot of people say, well, Tut was so reserved, he couldn't have too much influence on things. Well, you know, he became editor-in-chief of the Journal of Combinatorial Theory. He had a tremendous effect on the development here at the university. He was, I mean, he had a big effect on my life. I mean, I kind of knew him only from a distance, but he corresponded with me, for instance, before I came. I mean, he always had a lot more influence in what was happening. And even, actually, all that time at Bletchley, his position was junior assistant clerk. He didn't have an office. But when you actually see what happened at Bletchley Park, it all grows out of what Tut did. And I don't even think they realized it. But Tut was a very influential person, despite his quietness. I'm not answering your question, maybe for... Squaring the square is a problem in combinatorics.
Dan, thank you for another wonderful presentation. What I would like to comment on is the fact that Bill was so secretive about his code-breaking work during the war, and yet his academic sons and grandsons have been so involved in encryption. So I don't know whether Ron
This
can
happened
speak.
by osmosis or what? But
Right. So I'd like to hear from Ron if there
Yeah.
was any secrets passed on from generation to generation.
Here's Ron, the very first alumnus from the University of Waterloo. And Tut's PhD student, I should say.
In answer to your question, no. What happened is the Canadian government gave someone at the university here a contract to solve this problem, which was supposedly about ranging on the satellite, so they could tell the distance between them. The person here who got this recognized this was not for that purpose. This was code breaking. They recognized it as a code, and then we started, and we knew nothing about what Bill had done.
Maybe there is still osmosis, isn't there, or something?
More questions? Dan, what happened to Brooks, Stone, and Smith?
So his three friends, one of them was Arthur Stone. He became a topologist, and he at Princeton, and he married a topologist, and they had they produced a few little topologists. And Cedric Smith was a professor of statistics at the University of London. And Leonard, why he gave up mathematics after his war. He went into the war and was somewhat disillusioned by his experience there. But he actually did some important work. And I can tell you one thing about combinatorics. There's a theorem called Brooks' theorem, named after him. But I think Tut had a bit to do with the development of that theorem.
Thank you. Further questions? Okay, if not, before we go to the coffee break, let's thank Dan again.
Thank you. Thank you all.